We'll get started here. I will tell you that this is going to be a macro to a micro view around feedback, and that you know that feedback is a very large topic. So we won't touch on everything today, but I just kind of want to give us an outline to help frame up the conversation afterwards. So in the invitation, we talked about, see if I can get my slides to move forward. There we go. We talked about how important feedback is for the growth of the organization. Let me try that again. We talked about how feedback is so important for the growth of the organization as well as for the individual. And it's something I will say in my experience that doesn't happen enough. And we're going to explore some of those reasons why. Look at some of the barriers to feedback and help undo some of those so that we feel more comfortable with feedback. It's critical to the organization and creating a culture around feedback too, that these conversations happen more than once a year, which tends to be typical. We decided to schedule this at this time because a lot of organizations are heading into performance reviews right now. So feedback's a part of that. And they're also heading into goal setting for next year, which plays a role in what we're going to talk about with feedback. So also going to share a very practical framework for delivering feedback, which I'm sure that all of you are familiar with, but never hurts to revisit it. So that's a little bit about what to expect. And I wanted to start with this big macro view of the performance management process. Again, we're that time of year where those tend to be happening. And this tends to be if someone is going to receive feedback once a year, this tends to be when it happens. Now, of course, we want it to be happening more frequently than that, but as a part of the performance management process, you're a manager or leader, you're being required to do this and to have this level of conversation. This might be your one feedback event. So to give us an overview of what that looks like, it generally derives from what were the goals of the organization for this past year and what for any individual team member, what their part was in delivering on that goal. So when we look at the performance management process, it actually does set us up for some level of success in having meaningful feedback conversations because there can be specific goals and then the opportunity to clarify expectations around those goals. So what are we expecting from our team members and leaders in order to meet those goals? I just did a session with a leadership group on clarifying expectations. It led to quite a bit of conversation. And so we know just simply having a goal, which might be clear and straightforward, doesn't necessarily mean that there's clarity around what's expected. And so that's when conversations start happening between managers and their direct reports about what those expectations look like. A form of feedback? Yeah. A form of conversation and exchange? Absolutely. And if Marshall Goldsmith were here, who's the world famous executive coach, he would be talking about feed forward, which is really about that focus on what's for the future and what do we expect in terms of performance. I stick with the word feedback because people are more familiar with that, and it still provides that same opportunity for us to engage in these conversations where we help clarify things and outline what the expectations are. Once that's clear, and if we're still in this framework of doing it once a year is not enough to make sure that our team, the direct reports, are on that path toward meeting that goal. It's just like the airplane flying from New York to California, right? they have a destination, but if they aren't checking in regularly and making adjustments, just a few degrees off, and they're not landing in Los Angeles, they're landing in San Francisco. And so it's the same way with the people that we're leading, is that we need to be having those regular check-ins in order to make sure that we're on course to meet those goals. I was doing some performance management development with several teams earlier this year. And when we got to this point, talking about check-ins, I said, so in your weekly check-ins, and you know that look you get on the screen where everybody's just looking at you like, that's not happening. So I said, okay, so maybe your monthly check-ins. And got a few smiles from that, but still some of those looks like there's no way that's happening either. And so I said, well, at least quarterly. And you could tell by the reactions that some of the leaders in this group were having those once a year conversations. We want these conversations to be much more frequent than that, in making sure that we're driving toward the goals that were set, but also to provide and start setting up that culture of ongoing feedback. So people are used to it and accustomed to, and it becomes part of the way we do things. That can lead us into this annual performance review, perhaps this time of year where we're actually rating people on how they performed in different areas for the year, providing them that feedback. And then as well, providing the development plan. So another organization that I was working with, they had the performance review process, and they had the 6 different categories in a scale of 1 to 5, 1 poor performance, 5 that would put you ready for promotion. And then they had the whole other half of the worksheet were these blank boxes for manager comments. Do you want to guess how many people were filling in the comments to the side? Yeah, hardly any. It was enough for them to get to the numeric score, but those comments to the right-hand side are the real opportunity for someone to talk about development. So how could, if someone is being challenged with delivering the quality of work in a timely manner, if that's somewhere they're scoring a 2 or 3 perhaps, how could that be improved? That's what needs to go in that blank there. None of that was happening. So again, that's the real opportunity that we have when we're having these kinds of conversations, is to be able to say, hey, if you're not delivering the quality and in a timely manner, what's getting in the way? What do you need help with? How can I help you as your manager improve the score? Oh, maybe it's delegation that's the issue. And then putting that plan in process. So again, the most common area where I see feedback occurring is when someone's doing this formal process, but we have the opportunity for so much more. So much more if we're doing these regular check-ins. So the check-ins, again, are we on a path toward reaching that goal? So are we still on course? Do we understand what's working and not working? If I'm talking to someone about delegation at the end of the year as part of their performance review, that means we've missed, I don't know, a good 8 months, 9 months that we could have been addressing this along the way. Maybe it took a while for the issue to surface, maybe it was 6 months, but still better than having that big time lag and the drop in performance. And it gives us the opportunity to develop solutions and path forwards. So for those of us who use a coaching approach to development, it's the opportunity to understand, okay, here's the obstacle, here's where we want to be, here's where we are. How do we bridge that gap, which is the essence of all coaching, is how do we move from here to there? And those conversations can happen between that manager and direct report and start making a change in the performance, as well as how that person feels about their position and their contribution. We'll talk about that more in a minute. So check-ins can also be translated to feedback. It really gives us that opportunity to have that feedback loop. What's working, what's not working. So if you want to call it check-in and that feels better than feedback, because feedback can be difficult for all of us, then awesome, call it a check-in. The other thing I wanted to take a look at today is what makes feedback hard. So can we begin to understand why this is not happening? Why leaders who know that this would be beneficial for their team, why it's not happening. So it's hard for both parties. It's hard for the giver and it's hard for the receiver, especially to give productive feedback. So one of the things that you may be picking up on as we've gone through this is there is an element of time that it takes. And sometimes that's a resistance. I don't have time to have those weekly check-ins. Remember the blank looks I got on the screen? Those blank looks. Well, okay, at least monthly. All right, some of those look soften, but not all of them. And what I know that many of us know is that slowing down and taking the time actually makes things faster in the long run. We just have to get over that initial hurdle. But here are some of the other hurdles we have to move past as well. If we're the giver, and for those of you on the call, I know all of you, and relationships are important. And so you likely have more than just an employee-employer relationship with anyone you're working with. And so there's some concern over, is this going to hurt the relationship by providing feedback? And actually, it's the opposite. Not providing feedback is more harmful than providing it. The challenge is, do we have the skill to do it effectively? So that's our next point. Is it so many of us, almost all of us, where do we get trained to provide feedback? Yeah, I've had to learn it through coaching, through all the reading that I do. Most of the people I work with in organizations, yeah, if they're modeling what they get from their manager, who again probably doesn't have any training, right? We just keep replicating poor delivery of feedback. So we do need to develop some skills in this area so that it becomes a productive function for the organization. The emotional discomfort, these aren't easy conversations to have. We can think about any conversation with someone that we need to have that's like, I'd really rather not. Yeah, can I just avoid this? Maybe they'll figure it out, right? Yeah, not going to happen. And then finally, that lack of clearness. Sometimes we know really specifically what we don't want, but it's hard to describe what we would like instead. If we're talking about behavioral, for example, or if we're receiving reports and they're late or pushing us up against a deadline, what would help, right? Having the report 3 hours in advance, having it 2 days in advance, whatever that might be. Again, this requires us to stop and think, what would I prefer instead? To get real specific about the intent in providing the feedback and the outcome that we want. So it's not easy for us as givers. It's not easy for us as receivers either. And that's where most of us think about it, is that feedback is hard, is in the receiving of it. it's also hard for the giver. So for the receiver, it starts to feel personal, particularly if it's poorly delivered. And if we think about how the human mind is wired, we know that from our caveman days that when we felt threatened, either our life was threatened or we were threatened by being pushed out of the community, because the way we survived back then were in communities, that led to a real fear of being left out and losing life. And so that fear overtakes us in the moment, and all of our executive function goes away. So it does feel very personal, again, if it's delivered poorly, and causes us to feel that fear of something happening to us physically, which is not truly happening in the moment. The other thing we don't like to hear is that somebody didn't like the way we did something, or that we actually failed to deliver. I won't go into details, happy to share later, but very specific memory of finding out on a Friday afternoon that I had failed to deliver on something to the person I was working with, and that awful feeling the whole weekend long of, oh my gosh, I had no idea, and I had no idea I had that level of responsibility. Sweated it the whole weekend, thought I was going to be fired. We worked it out. It was, thank goodness, those were hard conversations, but no one likes that feeling of, oh, I failed. And so that and the example I just gave take us back to that clarity of expectations. What are people expecting from us? And making sure we're really clear on that. As I've mentioned, if it's unexpected or poorly delivered, really hard to receive. Another example of unexpected can be if we're providing feedback in a more public place that's maybe better handled alone. So in teams, if we need to provide feedback in a team setting, if we've built a strong team, that can be appropriate because it leads to all other sorts of healthy practices within a team. But if it's more one-on-one about a performance issue, much better if we do it one-on-one. And then finally, if there's a lack of trust in the person that's delivering the feedback, the possibility of it landing and being acted on is greatly diminished, highly discounted, may even feel more personal. So it does depend upon the relationship that we have, how that feedback is received. So I mentioned a very simple model. I'm sure all of you are going to be familiar with this, which is situation behavior impact, created by the Center for Creative Leadership. It's a very straightforward model. I use this with all my clients, all leadership development programs, just to help people have a way to get specific and deliver feedback in a way that takes that personalization out of it. So we'll walk through this really quickly. Situation, you'd be very specific about describing the situation in which you're going to talk about the behavior. So it might have been that team meeting, or it might have been presentation with a client, for example. You want to describe the situation so the person knows exactly what you're talking about. A lot of feedback ends up being generic and vague. Well, you cut off Tim in the team meeting is specific. You cut off people and don't appreciate their viewpoints, not specific and not helpful. hopefully the person would ask you to provide example and you could say, well, you cut so-and-so off in the team meeting. But we want to be very specific around that, the behavior, cutting someone off, talking over them. And then, well, that's fine, you observed it. But the key piece here is the impact that it had on you. That makes me think you don't appreciate his contributions or his point of view. And then hopefully that kind of engagement would engage the other person so there's a conversation. Okay, well, Tim just needs to get over it. I cut everybody off. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit. Do you think that really helps the team, right? And then you start to have a conversation. And then hopefully, maybe a few months down the line, you provide that same feedback and the person's like, oh my gosh, thank you for pointing that out. I must have slipped up. I totally value Tim's ideas. I'm going to go talk to him and make sure that he didn't feel like I was discounting that. So very simple example of how delivering it well can open up the door for further conversation so that the feedback is received and sometimes even perhaps better understood by the person who observed it. So there is the opportunity for that. And that can lead to real meaningful change. One last thing I want to share with you is the impact of feedback. And Carlos, you'll appreciate this. It comes from Gallup. What they found, I'll start on the right-hand side, is, let me first define what you're seeing on the circles here. So the gray, black, those are our actively disengaged employees. Those are the ones that are rowing against the efforts of the organization, the team, and the people that they're around. Then we have our not engaged employees in the light green. They come in, they do their work, they deliver. Maybe they're 2s and 3s in their performance review, right? But they're not going above and beyond, which is what we see in the engaged employees. Those that are like, hey, I've gotten everything done, what's next? Or could I take this process and maybe we tweak it to do this? They're the ones that are thinking about the next step. And of course, we'd like an organization full of those. What you see on the right-hand side is that when we ignore our employees or team members and don't provide any feedback, the chance for having actively disengaged team members is at an all-time high. It's at 40%. And only a chance that 2% are those engaged, seeking the next opportunity kinds of employees. When we provide feedback that focuses on negative characteristics or is negative in nature, we see that actively disengaged drops almost in half. They got feedback, maybe some semblance that someone cares about how they perform. The other interesting aspect is that we go from 2 to 45 being engaged, right? What can I do next? That's with negative feedback. And then on the left-hand side, you see the positive. And so when we focus on strengths and positive characteristics, we've almost completely eliminated the actively disengaged. And maybe they're self-selecting out as well. We don't want them there. We have 61% that are actively engaged. So that's the power of impact, the power of feedback in the organization. And we've taken this from macro to micro and how that we can actually deliver that. And so with that, we'll move into conversation. So I really appreciated this picture. One of the first blogs I wrote, Leanna picked this out, one of the first blog I ever wrote about leadership and development was more about self-leadership and thinking about what's growing in your garden. And I was just at a leadership conference with Patrick Lencioni and Stephen M.R. Covey, both of them making reference to the nurturing and the growing, both of them making references to gardens in terms of employee engagement and developing.